All right, tonight we are finishing up our study on Balak and Balaam. We've discussed at length Balak, his reaching out to Balaam from Pethor to bring him to Moab. And he's brought Balaam to curse the children of Israel so that the children of Israel would not be successful in their endeavors to fight against Moab and Ammon. Of course, he doesn't know that God wasn't going to let them fight them anyway. He had given that land, and those people had been given that for Lot's sake because those were the children of Lot. But what we see in Numbers 24, as we've been noting regarding Balaam, he's never called a prophet of God. There's continued references to the fact that he was a diviner, a soothsayer. He sought to use sorcery here in chapter 24 and in verse 1. And it's kind of interesting how that despite all of this, he had a conversation with the donkey, excuse me, back in chapter 22, and didn't seem to think much of it. Again, we talked before about how it seems that Balaam is more like a prophet for hire, so to speak. Whatever God they're wanting to call upon, they bring in Balaam, who calls upon whatever God he's being paid to call upon. But here in verse 1, it says that this time he kind of seems to figure out that the sorcery wasn't what was causing God to speak his word to Balaam. And so here in verse 1, Balaam raised his eyes in verse 2. He sees Israel, and the Spirit of God came upon him, and the Spirit of God spoke through Balaam. And as we noted before, 3 times he was asked to curse Israel. 3 times instead he blesses Israel. And in all of these times, Balak gets upset. In fact, in verse 10, it's kind of reached a peak. And he says, look, you've blessed them these 3 times. Just go home. I was going to honor you, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Balaam's character here in just a minute. But the Lord has kept you back from honor. And so Balaam said to Balak, did I not also speak to your messengers whom you sent to me, saying, if Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the word of the Lord, to do good or bad of my own will. What the Lord says, that I must speak. And there's a lot of commentaries that suggest that Balaam is a prophet of Jehovah, and that he's showing great loyalty and faith to Jehovah. I believe that he is speaking literally, that he literally was not allowed to curse the people, because we know he wanted to. He wanted to curse the people, but he was not allowed to curse them. He blessed them instead. So, in verse 14, Balaam speaks to Balak, and he says, indeed, I'm going to my people. Come, I will advise you what this people will do to your people in the latter days. Now, there's going to be a 4th speaking from the Spirit of God here. It's not a 4th blessing necessarily. You've got the first 3 blessings, and now you've got a prophecy. And the prophecy is actually kind of interesting what he says here. So he took up his oracle and said, the utterance of Balaam the son of Beor, and the utterance of the man whose eyes are opened. By eyes being opened, I don't take this to mean that all of a sudden he has great faith in Jehovah. More, it's the fact that Jehovah has shown him what is to come to be able to tell Balak what's going to happen. The utterance of him who hears the words of God and has the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, who falls down with eyes wide open. I tend to think, again, this is more of the dawning of understanding in his mind. I'm fairly certain that he probably hasn't had this type of experience before. And so it sounds like he's showing kind of this awe of the power of Jehovah. That doesn't mean that he isn't still a prophet for hire, but that this is different. Something to do with this being so involved in receiving the words of Jehovah here has really opened his eyes to an extent. Verse 17, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and batter the brow of Moab, and destroy all the sons of tumult. Now, the statement by Balaam, I see him but not now, I behold him but not near, it seems to be suggestive that this is not going to happen now. And this isn't going to happen necessarily even soon. It's going to happen down the road, though. This is speaking into the future of what's going to take place. It says, a star shall come out of Jacob. Now, in most of our Bibles, star and scepter are both italicized, or both capitalized, which gives you what suggestion? That we're talking about whom? Jesus. Yeah, that seems to be the suggestion. There certainly is some component of this that you could take as messianic. And most of the scholarly writings and so forth suggest that we're talking about, in fact, some of these commentaries actually say this is the scripture that the wise men read about the star in the east and following him to where Jesus was born and so forth, following the star. I don't see that here. In fact, what's interesting is what we find about Moab, and then in verse 18, Edom shall be a possession, Seir also, his enemies shall be a possession, while Israel does valiantly. The primary, I believe, the primary focus of this prophecy is actually about David. Because when we start going into the Chronicles and the Kings, this is when we see Israel. In fact, all through the Judges, we have constant thorns in the side of Israel from the Moabites, from the Edomites, from the Ammonites. In fact, they're going to be mentioned on down here in just a minute, the Amalekites. And so these are going to be thorns in the side of Israel until David takes over. And David is going to utterly destroy most of these peoples. And so I wonder if verse 17, if the primary focus is about when will the end come for the Moabites. Balak is so concerned about Israel destroying them. In essence, to me, you got to go back to the context of the situation. For what reason would God be offering this prophecy to Balak? It's not to the children of Israel. It's to Balak. And I tend to think that it's both, on one hand, it's assurance, I guess, maybe, but on the other hand, it's also your time of judgment is going to come. But the fact that Balak is being told, your end isn't coming now. It's not near, but it will come. And David ultimately is the one who brings about that judgment. Now, are there references, interesting parallels to passages like in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 11? There are. And there are some possible messianic parallels. But to say that verse 17 is about Jesus specifically, I don't. A lot of the commentators try to draw like Edom and Seir and Israel doing valiantly. They try to draw that to Christ establishing the kingdom of God, and it kind of put to an end the kingship of man, and that is true. But I don't believe that that's what Balaam is prophesying about here. I think he's being deliberately, or God is deliberately speaking through Balaam about the Moabites and about these peoples who were involved and who will be involved in teaching the children of Israel to sin. You've got the Midianites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites specifically involved in that. So, but we see, and of course we talked about Moab specifically here, but then we have Edom shall be a possession. Does anybody remember who Edom was? Yeah, in fact Esau's second name was Edom, from whom came the Edomites. And so Edom, in fact, Mount Seir was kind of the center of the land of Edom, the descendants of Esau. And they were a thorn in the side of Israel for a long time, especially throughout the Judges. And then, verse 19, we have another capitalized reference. Out of Jacob one shall have dominion and destroy the remains of the city. Again, scholarly aspect of this, trying to connect it to Jesus, is that he'll destroy the physical connections to cities, or he'll destroy the physical connections to thrones. And yes, that's true, but I don't believe necessarily that's necessarily what God is revealing through Balaam here. Again, I tend to think we're talking about David. It's not capitalized in Hebrew. Okay, it's one's going to have dominion. Well, who's going to take over and is going to destroy these people? David is. Now, again, that's not to say there aren't messianic parallels there, especially the concept of the scepter shall rise out of Israel. But what's interesting is that is it Daniel 11? The one time in the Old Testament, the term Shiloh is used, and it's a reference to the Messiah. But the prophecy is that the scepter shall remain with Israel until Shiloh comes. And so I kind of think that's interesting, that scepter, what does a scepter represent? Rule, yeah. Rule, dominion, authority, kingship. Okay, you think about Esther. And the golden scepter that King Ahasuerus had. So I think it's interesting that in verse 17, a scepter shall rise out of Israel, whereas a parallel prophecy speaks that the scepter shall remain with Israel until Shiloh comes, the Messiah comes. So again, the scepter of Israel, I mean, you could say Saul, being the first king, technically was the first, but really Israel didn't hit its stride until David came. And certainly David was a man after God's own heart. And I really do think that that's what God is professing here. Out of Jacob one shall have dominion. Again, I believe we're talking about David here. And destroy the remains of the city. He's going to wipe out the Moabites. He's going to wipe out the Midianites, the Amalekites. And then starting in verse 20, he looked on Amalek, and he took up his oracle and said, Amalek was first among the nations, but shall be last until he perishes. The term was there is italicized, meaning that there's some wonder Amalek being first. Whether that means that Amalek, at least in the regions that we're talking about here, that outside of Israel, maybe the Amalekites one of the strongest of the kingdoms that they were going to face, which may very well have been the reason why God told Saul to go kill and destroy the Amalekites. That was one of the first things that he was told to do. But regardless, it's interesting because when you think about Amalek, who is Amalek? Does anybody remember what his relationship is? He is the grandson of Esau. And of course, we're talking about Edom anyway. So we need to kind of keep in mind, we're talking about a train of thought here. We're not going from people to people to people to people. We're talking about Edom, which is the descendants of Esau, Mount Seir, which is the center of Esau's descendants, the center of their land, and then Amalek and the Amalekites are a part of Edom. They are a tribe of Edom, of Esau. And so in verse 21, then he looked on the Kenites. Does anybody remember why the Kenites are necessarily a thing? Moses' father-in-law, what was his name? Jethro. He was a Kenite. Okay, he was a Kenite. And what's interesting is the Kenites, they were kind to Israel when they came up out of the land of Egypt. And in fact, there's references later, and among other prophecies that refer to the Kenites and how that you will continue to treat them well because they showed you great kindness for Moses' sake. And so in verse 21, he looked on the Kenites and he took up his oracle and said, firm is your dwelling place and your nest is set in the rock. Which, what does that suggest to you when you hear that? Does that sound like destruction to you? Yeah, it sounds like good standing. Okay, the Amalekites, they're going to be brought down. However, the Kenites, because of their great kindness, and again, Jethro was a part of that people, God is going to relent from destroying them, at least at that time. And that's part of what's being described here. Verse 22, nevertheless, Cain shall be burned, How long until Asher carries you away captive? And this is interesting because Cain, yes, it is the same Hebrew term as Cain of Genesis chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, Cain and Abel. But Cain is actually a derivative of Kenite. And so talking about Cain, it suggested Cain might very well have been the capital city of the Kenites. And as a result, what God is saying through Balaam here is that despite the fact that you treated my people well, one day it's not necessarily God going to be using Israel to bring judgment on the Kenites, but rather Asher. Now, does anybody know what the connection of Asher is? The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, who ultimately ended up taking over Judah and Jerusalem and the temple, he was called the king of Asher. In fact, his father gave him that title, that label, when he took over as king, the king of Asher. And so it seems to be referencing Babylon. And that when Jerusalem ultimately gets taken and the temple is destroyed, around that same time, that's when the Kenites are going to be taken as well. And they are going to be destroyed. So it's almost as if God's saying, you're not going to avoid destruction, but because of your kindness to my people, it's not going to happen for a while. And indeed it didn't. And then in verse 23, he took up his oracle and said, Alas, who shall live when God does this? But ships shall come from the coasts of Cyprus. The King James has Kittim, I believe, which is the old term for Cyprus. They shall afflict Asher and afflict Eber, and so shall Amalek until he perishes. Now, Eber was a son, or great-grandson of Shem. Remember Shem, Ham, and Japheth, of the sons of Noah. And Eber and the Eberite, I think they're called the Eberites, they were of the lineage of Shem. But what's being described there, interestingly enough, is there's actually a parallel passage talking about almost verbatim the same thing in Daniel 11, verses 30 through 32. And the same reference to great ships coming from Cyprus is referenced there. And basically taking out Babylon. Now, there were two great kingdoms that came after Babylon and in essence destroyed them. Okay, certainly you've got the Medes and the Persians. That took place, remember that happens midway through Daniel. But Daniel actually, in Daniel chapter 11, is actually prophesying about something past the Medes and the Persians. Who's going to be the first leader of the great kingdom that's going to come in ships and take over that area of the world? Alexander the Great and the Greeks. And then what's the next big kingdom that's going to come? Rome. Okay? And certainly that's connected in Daniel chapter 11. You read commentaries on that, and they all link it to the Greeks and the Romans coming by ships and great armies, taking that land, certainly initially the Greeks, but then the Romans as well. And the fact that verse 24 of chapter 24 of Numbers is almost verbatim the same thing that Daniel prophesies about. I think it's actually talking about the same thing. That Babylon itself, Asher itself, will be judged and will be taken out. Okay, thoughts or comments through this prophecy? And again, I think it's interesting, it's important to keep in context the purpose for this. I think this is all for, well, first of all, it's all for the glory of Jehovah. That's the first and foremost. But I also think it's interesting that Balak didn't ask Balaam to call upon Baal or to call upon Ashtoreth or any of the other gods. He asked to call upon the Lord. And certainly they would have known something about the Lord, about Jehovah, because they were technically descendants of Lot. So I'm sure they knew something of Jehovah. But the fact of the matter was, and who else also still existed, or well, We don't know for a fact, but we do know that Melchizedek, at least at the time of Abraham and Lot, there was a priesthood that was still in existence under the patriarchal law, or what we call the patriarchal law. Whether or not it still existed up to or after Mount Sinai, we don't know. But certainly there wasn't a whole lot of time there between what's being said here with the children of Israel about to enter into Canaan. I mean, we're talking, what, maybe 40 years-ish? I mean, 40 years in the wilderness that they wandered. So it hasn't been too awful long since Moses. And Moses actually, I think at this point, is still alive. Or no, Joshua. Moses is dead. Joshua hasn't gone into Canaan yet. But it's interesting because I still think that you've got still enough time there that some of these peoples may remember stories about Jehovah, stories about Sodom and Gomorrah, stories about Lot's wife. But some of those people might still remember those things. And it's interesting that Balak asked Balaam for the Lord's blessing to curse this people. Of course, Balak doesn't know Israel is God's chosen people. He doesn't know that. And so he's just worried about his country, his people. And God's saying, it's not going to happen now. One day it will. But right now it won't. But all of these peoples, it's not just going to be you and Moab. And it's not just going to be the Midianites. And it's not just going to be the Ammonites. It's going to be all of these peoples that exist in Canaan. It's going to be all of them that God is going to take out and bring to judgment. Thoughts or comments through that? All right. So then in verse 25, Balaam rose and departed and returned to his place. Balak also went his way. Whether or not there was any dialogue here about Balak asking questions, or maybe he felt at least some reassurance, knowing that nothing bad was going to happen to Moab at that time, nothing's said. We move to chapter 25 and in verse 1, though. Okay. We have Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices. Who's they here? They invited Israel. So who's they? The Moabites. Okay, these women and the Moabites. And the people ate and bowed down to the gods of the Moabites. Verse 3, Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. Then the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, every one of you kill his men who were joined to Baal or Baal of Peor. And so there's a Midianite woman in verse 6. So notice it wasn't just the Moabites who were involved in this. They presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and the sight of all the congregations from Israel who were weeping at the door of tabernacle of meeting. And when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation, took a javelin in his hand, and he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her body. And so the plague was stopped among the children of Israel. And those who died in the plague were 24,000. Now, there's a lot of interesting details here that we're missing. But one thing is for sure. First of all, we know at least Midian and Moab are involved in causing the children of Israel to lure the children of Israel. The children of Israel made their own choice. They weren't forced to do it. But they lured the children of Israel to worship false gods. You have harlotry being specifically mentioned with the women of Moab in verse 1. The worship of Baal there in verse 3. And then you also have in verse 6 exactly how this situation went down with this Midianite woman. It's been suggested that somebody came, when it says presented to his brethren a Midianite woman, is that basically they came and told. Not that they brought the Midianite woman herself, but they came and said, hey, so-and-so has a Midianite woman in his tent, and he's lying with her. And so when Phinehas hears about it, he goes to the tent, and they're in that relationship at that time, and he takes a spear and drives it through the both of them. is how this is generally considered to have gone down. And I just think it's really interesting, though, that in the connection to that, verse 8, the plague was stopped. So there has been a plague going on through Israel, apparently since the start of this harlotry with these false gods. And verse 4, God told Moses to take the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord. All those who had any connection to Baal, any connection to these women of eating the things sacrificed to the idols or sexual immorality, they were to be hung out in the sun. But that wasn't the only thing that was going on. There was some sort of plague in which 25,000 people, or 24,000 rather, in verse 9, died. So it wasn't just these leaders. It was all, presumably, whether or not these 24,000 were specifically the ones who were involved in the idol worship or not, I don't know. But there was a plague in addition to the killing of all those people who had any part of this committing of idolatry. Now, we have Moses and we have Aaron, or we have Moses rather, and we have Phinehas, and these references to the worship of these idols. Okay, but what we don't read is that Balaam had anything to do with it. Okay, that's not specifically mentioned here. But we continue on here in chapter 25, and notice in verse starting in verse 14. So they go up against the So starting in verse 14, the name of the Israelite who was killed, this is the one who was in the tent with this woman, who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, the son of Salu, leader of the father's house of the Simeonites. The name of the Midianite woman, I think it's interesting that the name of the Midianite woman is mentioned also, is Cosbi, the daughter of Zur. And then verse 17, harass the Midianites and attack them, for they harassed you with their schemes, by which they seduced you in the matter of Peor, and in the matter of Cosbi, the daughter of the leader of Midian, their sister, who was killed in the day of the plague because of Peor. Now, go forward to chapter 30. So, chapter 26, verse 1. After the plague, the Lord speaks to Moses and Eleazar, the son of Aaron. There's a census that takes place. Now, we go all the way to chapter 31. Starting in verse 1. Okay, now remember, Midian is not of Lot. Okay, it was only the Moabites and the Ammonites who were of Lot. They were the ones who were off limits to Israel when they went in to take Canaan. They weren't allowed to go up and fight against them. Midian, however, was fair game. Well, notice what Midian, because they were part of this three-prong effort to have Israel cursed by Balaam. Remember, you had the Midianites, you had the Moabites, and then God tells us later in Deuteronomy that the Ammonites were a part of this. Starting in Numbers 31, starting in verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take vengeance on the Midianites for the children of Israel. Afterward you shall be gathered to your people. Verse 3, so they arm themselves for war to take vengeance on Midian. And then in verse 7, they warred against the Midianites, just as the Lord commanded Moses. They killed all the males. They killed the kings of Midian with the rest of those who were killed. Here's the name of those 5 kings of Midian. And then Balaam, the son of Beor, they also killed with the sword. Now, and then they burned with fire the cities where they dwelt and so forth. Now, I think it's interesting. How Balaam ended up in Midian, I don't know. Okay, he said he was going to go home, and we already noticed where his home was, 500 miles north in Pethor. Okay, but apparently either he went home and then came back at some point. Okay, we don't know exactly how much time took place between the end of chapter 24 when he leaves and goes his way and chapter 31, or before going home he spends time in Midian, which is very possible. Okay, and while he was there, before he left to head back, he just happened to get caught in this in the crossfire here, which obviously isn't the case. God brought judgment upon Balaam. But I think it's very interesting because even within the text, you have Balaam, in essence, being destroyed, being killed, along with the kings of Midian and the Midianites. But in Joshua chapter 13, I can't do two things at once, starting in verse 21. So starting in verse 21, all the cities of the plain and all the kingdom of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon, whom Moses had struck, along with the princes of Midian, and there's their names. And in verse 22, the children of Israel also killed with the sword Balaam, the son of Beor, the soothsayer, among those who were killed by them. Okay, now, again, it doesn't sound as though Balaam just happened to be there and happened to get in the way and, oh, oops, I accidentally killed Balaam. Okay, this was deliberate. He was killed for a reason. And that reason, a lot of the aspects in his character comes up in the New Testament. And so when we talk about Balak and Balaam, we have to include what is mentioned about them here in, for instance, 2 Peter chapter 2. And in verse 15, starting in verse, so we're talking about these pseudo-teachers, these fake teachers, these individuals who present themselves, basically they're teaching people to do things that they ought not to do, and they're basically trying to convince them it's still holy, it's still righteous to do it. But then in verse 13, they will receive the wages of unrighteousness as those who count it pleasure to carouse in the daytime. They are spots and blemishes, carousing in their own deceptions while they feast with you, having eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin, enticing unstable souls. They have a heart trained in covetous practices and are accursed children. They have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness, but he was rebuked for his iniquity. A dumb donkey, speaking with a man's voice, restrained the madness of the prophet. Now, by man's voice here in verse 16, it doesn't necessarily mean it was literally a male's voice, because what gender was the donkey? She. It's mentioned several times in the account that it was a she, so it was with a human's voice that spoke, whether it was male or female voice, doesn't really matter. But regardless, a human voice was speaking from the donkey. But the point of verse 15 is that he loved the wages of unrighteousness. And then in Jude, verse 11, Jude, and in verse 11, again, he comes up, Balaam does. Very similar context to what Peter's warning about regarding these fake teachers, fake brethren, who, at least in Peter's account, maybe at one time were faithful and then fell away and are trying to draw other people with them. But these speak evil of whatever they do not know, whatever they know naturally, like brute beasts, and these things they corrupt themselves. Woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain. They have run greedily in the error of Balaam for profit, and perished in the rebellion of Korah. It's interesting that Jude mentions 3 Old Testament situations and then likens the same character that these individuals have with those situations, and describes the evil character of Cain, of Korah. Of course, remember the rebellion of Korah, the earth swallowed up him and all those who were supporting him. But then also the error of Balaam for profit. Again, going back to the text of Numbers, we don't read. In fact, Balak himself says, the Lord has kept you from being paid. The Lord has kept you from receiving the honor that I told you I would give you because you didn't do what I hired you to do.
But it almost sounds like he just said, I'm going to take matters in my own hand, and maybe he went to Midian. I mean, Moses says, and in verse 31, they caused the sons of Israel through the counsel of Balaam and trespass against the Lord. So he said something to them.
Through the counsel of Balaam.
Through his own words, maybe he figured, well, I'll use my own words to get Midian to trip up Israel.
Right. Well, what's interesting, you combine this with Revelation chapter, I think it's chapter 2 with the church at Pergamum. Revelation chapter Where am I? Yeah, Revelation 2, verse 14. Okay, so here's the church at Pergamum, and at Pergamum you have three factions in essence. You've got one who's doing what's right, okay, but Jesus has aught against them because there are two other factions there. One of them holds to the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, verse 15, but the other holds to the doctrine of Balaam. I have a few things against you because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. Now, these things sacrificed to idols, sexual immorality, we see that in Numbers 25. What we don't see is that Balaam taught Balak. But this is, if you want to get Israel kind of out of God's grace here, this is what you do. And it makes me wonder, going back to Numbers, okay, between Numbers 24 and the end of the chapter here at verse 25, Balaam arose, departed, returned to his place. Balak also went his way. If Balaam had a brainwave, okay, Balaam says, I literally cannot curse the people for you. I can't do it. Okay, God will not let me. But if you want God to curse his own people, okay, you want to get the people of Israel at odds with Jehovah, here's what you do. Lure them away to false gods, or to the gods of Moab and the gods of the Midianites and so forth. And that's exactly what we see in chapter 25. And so it's as if Balaam attempted to find a loophole whereby he could still get paid and he could receive that honor that Balak had offered him. And when you combine that with all the references to the fact that he was greedy, that he taught Balak to sin, that by Balaam's counsel, Israel was lured away. Again, that's not to take anything away from Israel, the fact that they chose to do this. Why did they do that? Okay, somebody tries to teach you, hey, let's go worship Baal. You would think they would have said no after everything that God had done for them, but it's happened over and over again with them. And so it all ended up leading to them having a plague and all this that took place, which ended up delaying a lot of the efforts to go into Canaan for a period of time as it happened. All right, we will stop there. We will finish up our questions. There are a couple of questions I want to focus on and a couple more references I want to look at before we finish up our study of Balaam. We'll finish that up not next Wednesday, but the first Wednesday of January, I guess. Theoretically, as of right now, we're planning to be traveling next Wednesday, so 2 weeks from tonight. And then we're going to move on to John the Baptist. That'll be our next character study, and I'll try to have those notes Sunday for everybody on the table. Thanks, everybody.